Hi, this is Mrs. Duncan, your Humanities 101 teacher, and as we're coming to the end of the semester, and our last couple of chapters, we're just sort of now shifting over to some things that are less genre-based. We looked at the genres of music and literature and theater and art. Now we're kind of looking at things conceptually and philosophically as you're coming and starting to wrap up the semester with your final projects. And this chapter takes in the things that are art-like and distinguishes them from art. And so that's the question, is it art? And the textbook, the rest of the chapter's name is or something like it. So we're going to look at those categories where it's something like art typically. So they remind you of our definition that we started with in Chapter 2, that a work of art has form and content. Content, is subject matter, it's meaning, it's sending some particular kind of, it just has a depth of message, and it has artistic form, which means it's, that clarifies that subject matter, gives us insight more than just reproducing it. Another thing that a work of art brings that maybe other things do not is it reveals values. Something that is art-like is not necessarily revealing values, although that can be argued. And so it's important to distinguish art from the art-like, and there is disagreement. If it says on page 352, what's revelatory to one culture might not be to another. Something that wasn't understood in its own time period later becomes valued, and the depth of it becomes more recognized. So, there is a lot, the boundaries between art and art-like are debatable. You might say, but this is revelatory, or this does have subject matter. And so it's just a basis for distinguishing, and we're going to take a look at the things that are considered more art-like and not typically agreed upon to be truly art by that definition. One thing that's shared, though, is this idea of crafting. What they do is skillful, and it uses some medium, whether it be paint or wood or plastic or whatever, stone. There is crafting involved, so it's not a matter of talent per se. There is skill. It's just something else that makes something a work of art. It's a higher level of expectation and for what it brings to civilization, to the culture beyond the moment. And so they also give the definitions at the bottom of 354. But before we look at that, you see the general kind of categorization for guidelines for types of art-like creations in sort of a chart. Sort of the kind of orangey for what's traditionally thought of as art, and the avant-garde, outside the box kind of things that are considered more art-like. And we're going to take a look at these. Well, they're all art-like, sorry, but it's just some are more traditional and some are more out of the box. So, but these are all the things that are in there. So even within things that are art-like, there are definitely differences, whether they reinforce, cultural values and follow establishment, or whether they're anti-establishment, whether the craftiness and skill involved is emphasized or whether it's de-emphasized. That's not what's going to distinguish it from art. It's going to be these other things. All right, so the definition of craft. Craft is that skillful use of the medium, and the craft or craft work is the product. So you might be a crafty person in a good sense, like you make crafts. You may or may not be considered or consider yourself an artist. Let me give you a good modern example too. You have, pretty much everybody's familiar with Pinterest, right? And there are a lot of crafts, there's a lot of things, and what most of us do is we see an idea on Pinterest and we copy it. We might copy it, very accurately, or maybe not so well, but we would not be artists. We didn't construct anything artistic. We're just copying, we're imitating. It's not that everything that's art-like is imitation either, and even the thing that we're copying may not be really considered art. It may just be someone who's very good at their craft, a design and a floral arrangement or so forth. And maybe that'll help you distinguish it a little bit. All right, the first big category is illustration. And there are subcategories for this: realism, folk art, and popular art. Okay, and we'll look at some examples of those. In our world, we have illustrations all the time, and they could be realistic. They just present subject matter, but they don't have necessarily an artistic or unique form. And something key on that is the question on the page 354, pretty much in the middle. And it says the key, does the work give us insight? Okay, that's kind of a key idea. Does it give us insight? The example on page 355, if you look at the little picture, there's this woman with a purse. Well, she's basically a very realistic mannequin, and it describes an experience of one of the authors of the book who actually was tricked into thinking that she was real until he kind of took a closer look. It's kind of novel. It's very realistic. You might go, wow, they're really good. They made that a very realistic presentation, but it doesn't provide any insight. It doesn't help you learn anything more about the woman or about women in general or our time. It doesn't speak to anything and give us insight about anything. We might just marvel at, wow, that was cool. I was kind of tricked. So realistic, but it's not considered a work of art. Folk art, I've got some good pictures coming up, but there's no universal definition, so it makes it a little hard, but it's anything that's not considered fine art. Less sophistication, more like the word says, folksy, expressions of the average person, and it's not that high art, not to say it doesn't have value, but just doesn't get in that category. Pop art, popular art, that's pretty much contemporary. Pretty much everybody just thinks it's cool, but again, it doesn't provide any insight. So let's take look at a couple of examples. All right, one of the most famous illustrators, Norman Rockwell. Okay, and you might say he reveals values, right? American values or an ideal. This is called freedom from want, but he's basically just illustrating an idea, and there's nothing of depth that's revealed here through the construction of it, but it's a realistic representation of an ideal. Everybody gathered around the Thanksgiving table with all the generations there, and so art-like doesn't mean it doesn't have any message at all or meaning. It just doesn't have the level of depth and insight that something else considered art would be. But he's a great illustrator, and some people consider him an artist. So there's some discrepancy in those definitions. Folk art, here's just one little example, little paintings on plates. Of course, that would put it under the category of decoration too, but that may give you a sense of style there. Nothing insightful or revelatory here, just representative of a cultural style. And then pop art, even taking tomato soup cans, there's a picture of that on page 359, just a bunch of Campbell soup cans and put it on canvas, and it's neat, it's interesting, but doesn't give us necessarily any insight into the culture. A banana, Marilyn Monroe, it's just colorful. The last few are more negative. Propaganda, and this I'm moving forward a good bit here, but page 363. Art is often used for propaganda to persuade the masses of a particular idea that we would say is not really, it's kind of false perhaps. And the painting they give as an example is typical of Soviet propaganda. They're writing about us in Pravda and kind of idealizing the communist lifestyle and the rural farmers and how it's just, it's idealistic and that it's important. And this is from Moldova, which is in eastern Romania, and the really sad thing is that, and I have been to Romania, communism stripped Romania of, it was the breadbasket of Europe, and by the time communism was done with it in 2000, I was there in 2002, it wasn't that. It was far from that. It had been stripped down, and it's really, really, really sad. So what they kind of try to present in that photo as an ideal and what communism brings was just such a lie. So art can be used that way, and it's art-like, a painting. Okay, on to something a little bit lighter. The kitsch on the focus, page 364. It's all those sort of little, anything just tacky. Some people might say it's cute. It's the stuff you can buy off the shelf. It might be mass-produced. It might be tacky, like those little gnomes or the flamingos. It's art-like. I think that would be enough to say it's not really art. Um, and you might like to collect the gnomes and they're cute and everything, but they're just not considered fine or high art. Decoration, like you put on, it could be stitching, embroidery, things like that. Or frame, a picture frame, which is what they have as an example on page 367. Added to Raphael's Madonna della Sedia, hope I'm saying the last part right, added to enhance something. It's subordinate or less than what it decorates. So it's art-like, but it's rarely itself considered the art. Then they even mention graffiti, it's put on walls, and some of it's, pretty decent, pretty interesting, pretty remarkable, but it's decoration. All right, so that the first category is illustration. The next one is idea art. Now, this is different from being revelatory. Even the Dadaism is just supposed to be meaningless, and it just raises questions. It's just attack. It kind of came up around World War I when there was just this big backlash against establishment because it had produced this massive world war. All the ideals that they had when they overthrew all these monarchies and so forth, supposed to make everything work well, and instead, some people came in the void and took over, made things worse, and we had World War I, and then not too long after that, World War II. So they're trying to just shock people with things that are somewhat meaningless. So they aren't really revelatory of a value. It's kind of the anti-value thing. I'm going to go back and forth here a minute. Duchamp was a main one there. You can look him up and see some other things. But here's Picabia, who's a Dadaist painter, and we have this in our book, a little one on page 370. It's just a blot of ink, and he called it the Blessed Virgin. Well, it's not supposed to really, have deep insight or meaning. It's just kind of a rebellious idea and doesn't really, in one sense, mean anything, and then you can try to interpret meaning, but it's just whatever you want to make it. So that's, whoops, I went the wrong way. Let's get back. There we go. Okay. Then conceptual art. And this is jumping forward to page 372. The best example here is the wrapped Reichstag. This is conceptual art is not permanent. You can only see it, a picture of it. They have a picture of it. The actual piece of art, so to speak, that's art-like is the building. You can see it there, it's all wrapped. It doesn't say what's wrapped in, some kind of material. They wrap it and then they take it down. It's just, they're making some sort of statement and then they remove it. It's just a concept. So, all right, so we just looked at that. All right, performance art. And let's see if how quickly we can wrap up here. Physicality. It's really these artists who put stuff on their bodies and try to make a point. They didn't put many pictures in there, and if you read about it, some of it can be offensive that has been done in the past, and they just sort of making statements, and they're anti-establishment, and it's really hard to put in they're making a statement but doesn't mean it reveals a value or has some insight. Shock art is even more shocking, so it's meant to scandalize and repel. The example they give, they don't even show a picture because it's so offensive, where they use all kinds of gross things, and and that's the whole point of it. That's all I'm going to say about that. Last to finish up is again, this is not really art. It's art-like, but it doesn't really pass the test. But it's out there, and some people want to say it's art, and using the definitions we have here, we can say, well, no, it might be art-like, but it's not real art. Virtual art is the last category. Remember, we're looking at art-like, not real art. Based on computer technology, video games. Here's a little picture from Call of Duty. It's its own little, thing. But let's just summarize to finish up. If it's art-like, it lacks a revealed subject matter, content that brings fresh meaning into our lives. Yes, it can be attention-holding. Yes, it can be thought-provoking. It can be beautiful. But it lacks this sort of revelatory power that lends to sustained participation. And that's key. That's part of the definition. It's one reason why that conceptual art you can't sustain participation in that, or the performance art. The depth of meaning is lacking from, say, virtual art or kitsch or some of these different ones. But Again, the line between something being art and art-like is sometimes very hard to pin down and very debatable, so there can be disagreements, but that's how you distinguish it. That's what that chapter is about, because you're going to encounter things and wonder how it fits in. Well, that's all for chapter 14, and we're almost on the